Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naomi Harlan-Bacchus. I am with FASEB, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, and welcome to the first of two webinars, Streamlining Institutional Requirements for Animal Research. This is in partnership with the Council on Government Relations, and we will be kind of diving into ways that we can reduce administrative burden, both from the administrative perspective, and next week we will take a look at from the scientist and the PI perspective. So I'm going to give about another minute for everyone to trickle in here. But we do have a lot of content to go through, so I'm going to, go ahead and get started. So first I'd like to thank the speakers first and foremost for taking the time out of their busy schedule to come and be with us and give us their insight on this very important topic. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Arat Tamasian. He is the Chief Research Compliance Officer at Harvard University. Dr. Sally Thompson-Iritani. She is the Director of Animal Welfare and Research Support at the Washington National Primate Research Center at the University of Washington. Dr. Axel Wolf, who is the Deputy Director of the NIH Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, or OLAW, and Dr. Betty Goldentire, the Director of Animal Welfare at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Okay, so we do have quite a bit to go through, but this is going to be our overall agenda. First, we're going to discuss the 2018 Council on Government Relations Survey Report. And Dr. Tamasian will provide a background on why we conducted this report and what it showed. And then we're going to dive into three major topics for discussion. First, annual protocol review, and that will also include VBC, DMR. We will also talk about protocol rewrite at triennial review. And then lastly, we will touch on animal numbers, pain and distress classification, and literature review. To end the webinar, we will have a quick question and answer session. And if you can see at the bottom of your screen, you can see where you can ask some questions. And I will go over this again at the end. But I quickly wanted to NIH, OLAW, and USDA, we are so grateful for them to participate in this webinar. However, I do want to make it very clear that they will speak only towards the existing current policies. Right now, any policies that are being revised or edited, they cannot provide comment on that because it's just too early in the process. So to ask a question, you can see based on these arrows here where you type in your question and submit, and that of course will be at the very end. And you can also see underneath your questions, you will see handouts. There are three handouts that are given to you. If you would like to look at these later, they will also be referred to throughout the presentation. The first one will be the 21st Century Cures draft report released by NIH, USDA, and the FDA. We will also have the 2018 Cobra Report that we will be referencing throughout this presentation. And then there are two websites that are in one handout discussing the National Institutes of Health Guide Notice and an ALOS policy template. Okay. So with that, I will take it over to Dr. Sally Thompson and we will get started.
Thank you, Naomi. So to begin with, before we start talking about reducing burden, we want to be very clear. Reducing burden does not mean reducing animal welfare. We support regulations and oversight. We want to give you tools to help balance compliance with the very important work of animal care and scientific advancements. By reducing burden, we want to shift resources to animal care and enrichment and ensure that scientists are supported in their efforts to conduct humane research. Go ahead and turn it over to Ara.
Thank you. Yeah. So, as a background to the 2018 COGR, as most of you are familiar, in 2014 there was the National Science Board, and in 2016 there was a National Academy of Sciences report, both of which were talking about the burden on the faculty and making recommendations. The 2016 report from the National Academy actually had a very specific recommendation for the universities and research institution, in which it sort of suggested that institutions look internally at their policies and procedures to identify where they are doing essentially self-imposed burdens, and if there are ways that they can streamline. As a result of this, Koger actually got involved with the process, and we developed a checklist, which ultimately resulted in what became a survey of the institutions. So what we will be talking now is really the result of sort of the survey, or of what people can do to remove or eliminate the burdens specific to the animal care and use. There were other areas that were identified as self-imposed burdens. So Koger has 188 members, institutions. These are research-intensive universities and research institutions. 94 of the Koger's members, which is roughly 50% of them, actually responded to the survey. And what we noticed as a result of the survey, that institutions were more likely to take actions to reduce the burdens if they actually felt or heard that the federal agencies were clearly telling them that they don't need to do this. And we're hoping that this forum would be one where it would clarify some of these issues, and we will provide kind of some clear guidance. One of the other factors that we found out is that there's a complexity of the multiple sets of regulations, policies, and guidelines, and anything that the agencies can do to sort of help us with this would obviously alleviate a lot of uncertainty. Often what happens is when you have multiple requirements, people tend to apply the most restrictive to everything. So with that in mind, we can start sort of talking about the actual survey results and discuss some of the findings. If we can go to the next slide, please. So in the survey, we asked the participating institutions if they have eliminated the protocol renewal for non-USDA species and non-Department of Defense protocols for which they are not required. So these are instances where we do not need to do annual renewals. 47% of the institutions indicated that they have, and of the remaining 53% of the institutions that have not, 11 of them, or roughly another 12%, indicated that intended to do. So that would have brought the total to roughly 59%. So there are still 41% of the institutions that are continuing to do the annual review. The institutions that have not sort of implemented this, in essence, indicated that they wanted to reduce the confusion and potential for non-compliance by holding all protocols to the same standard. So I'll open for my colleagues to talk about.
Yes, so as annual renewal of non-USDA, non-DoD protocols is not a regulatory requirement, the recommendation is that institutions should consider the impact to the research and animal care community and ensure that these protocols do not increase the time and effort of faculty and staff unnecessarily. Several institutions mentioned using annual renewal of non-USDA, non-DoD protocols for post-approval monitoring. So it is important to look at alternative ways of accomplishing these tasks, and we will give you some examples of some alternatives below.
Right. For PHS studies, there is no requirement for annual review as with the USDA. However, some institutions find it's convenient to combine the PHS requirement with the USDA one and therefore conduct the annual review for non-USDA animals as part of the PHS continuing review requirement. But there are many other ways to conduct continuing review, such as by post-approval monitoring, semi-annual review, laboratory visits by an IACUC coordinator or veterinarian, transmission of feedback to the IACUC from technicians, animal care staff, or even investigators themselves making self-reports.
Right, thanks, Axel. And of course, this is Betty, for USDA protocols using USDA species, there is a requirement for continuing review, no less than annually, but the regulations and the agency recognize that IACUCs have options as to how they're going to conduct that continuing review. And it's important to tailor the review to maximize the usefulness of it and minimize unnecessary burden. The options that Axel discussed could certainly meet the USDA regulatory requirement, as long as they are conducted under the auspices of the IACUC, because as you know from the regulation, it is clearly the IACUC's responsibility to conduct the continuing review. Art talked earlier a little bit about the draft report, and Naomi mentioned that we can't get into details, but the draft report by OLA, USDA, and FDA on the 21st Century Cures Act kind of talks about a potential regulatory change that might harmonize this area of confusion. I want to mention that any change to the regulations would go through the federal rulemaking process. And what that means is plenty of opportunity for public comment and very transparency as we go along. I would also add that animal care is still in the process of ensuring that our guidance documents don't contain any regulatory overreach. And we're really very close to having the revision of Chapter 7 of the inspection guide. This is that whole chapter that's dedicated to inspection of research facilities. And we're hoping to get that posted to the website very soon.
Thank you. So we also asked the survey participants that if as a default their institutions are actually implementing the designated member review rather than the full committee review. 66% of the institutions indicated that they do use the designated member review as a default, and then another 3% indicated that they do plan to use this action. So that would have brought the whole total to about 69% of the respondents using the DMR.
Yes, so among the institutions that do not plan to implement the DMR as a default, 5 indicated that FCR is used for the USDA Category E protocols that have pain or distress that will not be alleviated, and 3 for the Category D protocols, which are pain or distress that will be alleviated by IACUC-approved methods, or a subset of D, with 1 indicating that what can go to DMR is generous, and that defaulting to DMR would not be appropriate for them in those circumstances. So creating a hierarchy of protocols that require full committee review can be an effective approach and ensure that the most invasive studies are appropriately reviewed. There is also value, however, in having some flexibility to determine what goes to DMR FCR. Institutions should review their approach to ensure that it is improving animal welfare without creating unnecessary administrative burden. Now we'll turn it over to our regulators to get their perspective on this.
Sure. Institutions are certainly free to have a hierarchy to place one type of protocol to go to DMR, another to go to FCR. But from OLA's perspective, either method is equally acceptable. It's really up to the institution to decide which method they want to use.
Betty?
Yep, that's true under USDA too. The IACUC is responsible for determining the appropriate review process, and they can choose FCR or DMR. Unless any member requests FCR, then they have to do a full committee review. But DMR as the default option is fine, as long as the IACUC has a good process to flag protocols that should be going through full committee review. And in our experience, IACUCs are really good at flagging those protocols that should be going through FCR.
Thank you. So we also asked the participant if their institution has adopted the OLA's allowance for expediting protocol amendments via veterinary verification and consultation process, or VVC, in order to reduce or eliminate full IACUC involvement. 77% of the 94 institutions responded that they have adopted this process, and another 11% indicated that they planned to adopt this, which is good. This is a fairly high, about 85, 86% overall participation. Sally?
Yes, so the VVC process was implemented and encouraged by OLA and agreed to by the USDA to support expedited review of procedures that are already agreed to and approved by the IACUC. This has been very helpful for most institutions and can decrease the number of significant changes, amendments that the IACUC needs to approve. This does require some work up front, and there are several templates available which are included as attachments to accomplish this with minimal effort for a single institution. So this is really a great example of something that has really worked in helping us reduce burden. Now I'll turn it over to Betty for her assessment.
We have seen VVC reduce citations, because what Sally just said about helping institutions decrease the number of significant changes and amendments, this goes directly to those non-compliances where what's actually happening to the animal doesn't match what's in the protocol. If you can reduce that, you can reduce citations, and it's really good to see so many institutions implementing VVC.
I'll elaborate a little on this next slide regarding VVC. Now, some things do not qualify for it, such as changing from non-survival to survival surgery, changes proposed which result in greater pain or distress or degree of invasiveness, housing animals in a location not part of the animal program overseen by the IACUC, a change in species, a change in study objectives, a change in PI, or a change that impacts personal and personnel safety. Those have to go back to the IACUC for review and approval. They cannot go to VVC. Other items that don't need to go to the IACUC or to VVC are things such as correcting typographical errors in the protocol, correction of grammar, contact information updates, or change in personnel other than the PI. These can be handled administratively.
Perfect, thank you. So the other question we asked is how many institutions require or do not require, either way, a complete or a new protocol rewrite for the PHS triennial review. 33% indicated that they don't require. Another 13% indicated that they would eliminate this request or this requirement. That still leaves about 52% of the institutions who are requiring a full protocol renewal or a rewrite every 3 years. And by the way, as you can see, this was ranked as the one of the most onerous tasks during the 2018, which just sort of concluded, survey of the Federal Demonstration Partnership of the Faculty Burden. Axel?
Yeah, well, the PHS policy never called for a complete rewrite. It just says that the IACUC shall conduct continuing review, of each approved ongoing activity, including a complete review in accordance with 4C1 through 4, using DMR or FCR. So it's a complete review, not a complete rewrite.
Yes, thank you. There is value in updating studies. I think we all agree to that, but this should really be done throughout the life of the protocol using significant changes and amendments. And several institutions have implemented better ways of doing continuing review to improve protocol relevance and applicability. It's really a living document that should always be relevant to what they're doing with their research. Turn it over to Betty now.
Betty, yep.
Yep, and we'll talk a little bit about the term de novo. As you know, it doesn't appear anywhere in the Animal Welfare Act or the Animal Welfare Act regulations. And Axel and Molly Green did a little historical research into looking for where the term de novo came from. Apparently first used in the 1993 ILAR news publication. But this use of the term de novo and the triennial review versus continuing reviews not less than annually, these are the kind of little differences between PHS and USDA that can really cause areas of confusion, and that can kind of lead to unnecessary regulatory burden. So we definitely recognize it, and we are, identifying these areas and trying to see what we can do to work with you to move towards some sort of way to harmonize this and reduce the confusion.
Thank you.
Right. Betty's right. I was looking around to see where that term came from. And the ILAR article is the first time we've noticed it. And then the first publication from OLAW is the 2002 IACUC guidebook. And on page 96, it said the PHS policy requires that a complete IACUC review of PHS supported protocols be conducted at least once every 3 years. This triennial review is interpreted by OLAW as a requirement for de novo review, meaning that the criteria and procedures for review specified in 4C of the PHS policy must be applied not less than once every 3 years. This 3-year renewal document does not need to be completely rewritten, although updates and changes need to be included and obsolete information should be removed. It is a best practice to incorporate added amendments, although they can also be just attached. This document should then be reviewed by the IACUC using the criteria in the PHS policy at 4C 1 through 4 using DMR or FCR as for an initial review. The use of electronic protocol systems has made it easier to make changes, and so it shouldn't be that complicated to update a protocol for this triennial review.
Great. Thank you. So another one of the issues which had been raised as a burden and was included in our survey was related to the approximate or range of animal numbers. So the question we asked is how many of them are actually allowing for either a range or an approximate number versus an exact number. And what we found as a result of the survey was that 44% of institutions have taken actions to provide an approximate number or a range of animals needed for the research project, while as you can see, it means that there are still about 56% of the institutions who want to know the exact number, which at times it could be easier to define when you have a very small number of animals. At other times, it doesn't quite fit the sort of the scientific requirements. So some of the institutions suggested that the exact numbers are required for reporting, during their annual reporting, that they have received significant pushback from the USDA on this during their inspections. And they indicated that if USDA said that they don't have to do it, they won't, and they will actually, instead of using exact numbers, they will allow the range or approximate numbers. Betty?
So here I am to tell you that you could certainly use those approximate or a range of numbers. You can see the regulation right there on the screen. The proposal must contain the approximate number of animals, so an approximate number or a range is perfectly appropriate, completely meets the regulatory requirement. I do appreciate the feedback from COGR. We'll reinforce this issue with our VMOs. And if any of you experience or have any questions about this, please discuss it with your VMOs or the supervisor.
Thank you.
I'll cover animal numbers from the PHS policy perspective. So PHS policy 4D1 states applications and proposals, competing and non-competing, for awards submitted to the PHS that involve the care and use of animals shall contain the following information: identification of the species, and approximate number of animals used, which is exactly what Betty just said. So approximate number has always been in the PHS policy and is acceptable to OLAW and to the funding agency. The vertebrate animal section of the NIH grant application asks for a total number of animals by species, but again, this is, can be flexible. You may not know the exact number that are going to be used, so you make an estimate, and if the numbers start to change, then the investigator just amends the protocol. The U.S. government principles state the animals selected for a procedure should be of an appropriate species and quality, and the minimum number required to obtain valid results. Now, as far as the PHS policy does not explicitly require a mechanism to track animal usage by investigators, it does require that proposals specify a rationale for the approximate number of animals to be used and be limited to the appropriate number necessary to obtain valid results. This implicitly requires that institutions establish mechanisms to document and monitor numbers of animals acquired and used, including any animals that are euthanized because they are not needed. Monitoring should not exclude the disposition of animals inadvertently or necessarily produced in excess of the number needed or which do not meet the criteria, such as genetic requirements established for the specific study proposal. So that means any animals that are used need to be accounted for by the IACUC, even if the investigator did not want them. Those animals are still living vertebrates that come under the authority of the PHS policy. Now, in our guidance document on significant changes, it also addressed numbers. A significant change that may be handled administratively according to an existing IACUC reviewed and approved policy without additional consultation or notification is an increase in previously approved animal numbers. So if there's a policy in place that the IACUC has reviewed and approved addressing animal numbers, then increases can be made by this method. Now, as far as using fewer animals than approved, this does not even require IACUC approval, notification, consultation, or any administrative handling.
Thank you for that clarification. That was very helpful. And many institutions have adopted a variety of administrative, electronic, and manual mechanisms to meet their institutional needs and be in compliance with these PHS policies. If you have specific questions on these, I encourage you to reach out to your colleagues at other institutions and see how they're dealing with these requirements if you're struggling with it at your institution. So now we'll go on to our next topic.
Perfect. Yeah. So we asked the participants as part of the survey if they have or if they would consider discontinuing the USDA pain and distress classification for non-Animal Welfare Act species for which they are not required. Of the 93% of the institution that responded, or 93 institutions that responded, 15% indicated that the institution has discontinued the classification for non-animal welfare species, and another 11% indicated that they plan to implement this at some future point. So at the time of the survey, 85% were not using the non-AWA species.
Okay, so while it is not a regulatory requirement to categorize non-USDA, non-DoD projects into pain categories, how does OLAW then assess pain and distress if we don't require that? Well, we've got three major documents I'd like to just quickly go over. Next slide. Yeah, this is very dense, but I'll just go over this quickly. So the U.S. government principles, three of them address how pain and distress is supposed to be handled. It talks about minimizing discomfort, distress, and pain when consistent with sound scientific practices. Unless the contrary is established, investigators should consider that procedures that cause pain or distress in human beings may cause pain or distress in other animals. Procedures with animals that may cause more than momentary or slight pain or distress should be performed with appropriate sedation, analgesia, or anesthesia. Surgical or other painful procedures should not be performed on unanesthetized animals paralyzed by chemical agents. So don't work on animals under paralytics. Animals, unless they've got anesthesia on board. Animals that would otherwise suffer severe or chronic pain or distress that cannot be relieved should be painlessly killed at the end of the procedure or, if appropriate, during the procedure. This same information is reiterated in the PHS policy. Procedures with animals will avoid or minimize discomfort, distress, and pain to the animals, consistent with sound research design. Procedures that may cause more than momentary or slight pain or distress to the animals will be performed with appropriate sedation, analgesia, or anesthesia unless the procedure is justified for scientific reasons in writing by the investigator. Animals that would otherwise experience severe or chronic pain or distress that cannot be relieved will be painlessly killed at the end of the procedure or, if appropriate, during the procedure. Applications and proposals for award shall contain a description of procedures designed to assure that discomfort and injury to animals will be limited to that which is unavoidable in the conduct of scientifically valuable research, and that analgesic, anesthetic, and tranquilizing drugs will be used where indicated and appropriate to minimize discomfort and pain to animals. So how do we find out what is proposed regarding pain and distress minimization in a grant application? It's found in the vertebrate animals section, where it asks the investigator to describe the interventions, including analgesia, anesthesia, sedation, palliative care, and humane endpoints to minimize discomfort, distress, pain, and injury. And it asks the investigator whether they have described in detail circumstances when animals may experience discomfort, distress, pain, or injury, and which procedures are then used to alleviate that discomfort, distress, pain, or injury. It asks for which tranquilizers, analgesics, and anesthetics are used, actually asking the investigator to identify these drugs by name and class, any kind of provisions for palliative care or housing, plans for post-surgical care if applicable, and to discuss the humane experimental endpoints if relevant. So even though we don't do what Betty's going to describe next, this is how OLAW and the PHS address the issue of minimizing pain and distress in the research animals.
Perfect. Okay. Betty, do you have anything to add?
No, I think
Okay.
we're going to get to that in a minute.
Perfect. All right, so if we go to the next question, excuse me. So we asked the participants if they have eliminated the requirement for literature search for category D and E procedures for non-USDA species. 24% of the respondents indicated that their institution has eliminated this. Of the 75 institutions, or 76% that responded no, 67 of them responded that, as a follow-up question, that the institution plans to implement the action, while, almost, sorry, I misquoted the number. 62% indicated their institution would not implement the changes, and 10% would. So among those that said that their institution doesn't want to implement or does not plan to implement the action, several indicated that the use of the same standards provides consistency and reduces confusion and the potential for non-compliance. Sally, any insights?
Yeah, so the majority of institutions stated that they would not reconsider, as Ara had just summarized, requiring literature searches for non-USDA species, even with the realization that is not a requirement. So I think that what we need to do is be providing and sharing information on how we look at alternatives by alternative methods, and literature search may be one way, but there are obviously other ways that we can be doing this and providing for our researchers, because I do think that the researchers feel like literature searches are not giving them the information that they need to really address what alternatives are available.
Thank you. Okay. So as a next question, we actually asked the participants if their institution has eliminated the requirement for a literature search for Category C procedures for USDA and non-USDA species. 62% of the institutions indicated that they have. Of the 36 institutions, or 38% that indicated that this hasn't been eliminated, 33 intend to do this, while the rest will not eliminate the literature searches for Category C procedures. Betty?
So I just want to back up to the purpose of this whole regulation about consideration of alternatives. The very first paragraph under 2.31D talks about procedures that involving animals will avoid or minimize discomfort, distress, or pain to the animal. So the purpose of that beginning of D, which is the IACUC review, the purpose of it is to avoid or minimize discomfort, distress, or pain. Now, as Sally said, there's more than just a literature search to look at, how to avoid, minimize pain or distress. But if you're using animals in a protocol that does not cause more than momentary pain or distress, then there's no need to consider alternatives. So the regulation is about painful procedures and doing what we can to avoid or minimize pain or consider alternatives where they're available. It's not about really just overall reducing research or reducing the number of animals. It's really directed toward pain or distress. And so there's no requirement at all. There's certainly, it's up to the institution. If you want to do that, you certainly can, but there isn't any requirement. And I think it's important to go back to one thing that Sally said earlier in the presentation, that sometimes by recognizing areas where we can reduce unnecessary burden and sort of shifting those resources, we actually can do, improve some animal welfare by shifting those resources.
Great. Thanks, Betty. And I actually do strongly agree with you that by eliminating a lot of unnecessary burdens, we can redirect our time and effort to areas which are more likely to cause sort of much higher improvements in animal welfare. So I agree with you on that one. With that, I think unless the panelists have anything else, I will pass it on to Naomi for the questions.
Yes, I think we're ready to wrap up. That was a great presentation on, again, a very important and timely topic. I think that's something that we all needed to hear and to distribute amongst our colleagues so that we can streamline a lot of these regulations. And it's important to emphasize that reducing administrative burden does not mean we will reduce animal welfare, just as Sally said at the beginning. So I think that's a primary theme we want to keep prominent throughout. So with that, we will begin to start taking some questions. Again, you see here on your screen how you can go about that process, and I will, on my end, read them. And okay, so our first one is, if institutions are not requiring a triennial rewrite, how are they ensuring PIs have reconsidered alternatives to painful procedures which must occur at least every 3 years?
So this is Sally, and I think I can address that question. If you don't need to require a total rewrite of the protocol, you can have certain questions that you're asking at the triennial, and that would be one of the questions. So there are certain boxes, so you could have the overall protocol in an electronic system move forward, and then you can have certain pages that have to be filled in fresh at your triennial. So that's the way I think a lot of institutions that are using electronic databases are doing it. But you could similarly do that if you were still in a paper-based format where you have one sheet of questions that has to be filled out at your triennial renewal.
Great.
Yeah,
Does
this is
anyone else
Ara.
want to add? Okay.
I just wanted to add that I fully concur with Sally in my previous lives, where I was actually actively having protocols. This is how it was done. That at the end of, I mean, especially in the age of electronic, because in reality, every time you submitted a modification, your protocol was updated and the latest version was available. And what we realized is that just adding about, I think there were 6 or 7 questions every 3 years that you had to respond as part of the renewal. So that's a very easy way to do these days electronically.
Okay, great. Next question, will VMOs be trained and given this information as well as on the animal numbers range item? For example, will this slide presentation be made available to VMOs? This entire presentation recording will be available online in about a week or so. So I will touch back with everybody once it is made available, and I'm pretty certain that you will receive an email notifying you that it is available on our archived list. So stay tuned. I do believe the VMOs can absolutely have access to this. Okay, next question. Regarding the administrative review, are there any requirements or suggestions on who can conduct such a review and if an official approval letter or notification to the PI is necessary?
No, for the administrative review, it can be an IACUC coordinator. I mean, they're just, the examples I gave are just basically correcting grammar or something, or like maybe a room number or something like that in the protocol. So that can just be handled between the investigator and the IACUC administrator, for instance.
Gotcha. Right. So that table that we referred to in the back of what can and cannot
Right.
must go through IACUC is something that could come in handy.
Yep.
Okay. Next one, regarding animal numbers, what about the methods of counting young animals, such as mouse pups?
Okay, I can speak to that because we do require mouse pups to be accounted for at the first handling. So when it doesn't mean go in there and disturb them when they've just been born, but once the cage is changed or the investigator starts manipulating them, there needs to be an accounting of that litter. You're not supposed to wait until weaning or some other artificial number. The first handling by either the animal care staff or the investigator has to account for how many pups there are and that number recorded, and those animals are considered live vertebrate animals, even though, like I mentioned, even though if they're not wanted and they're euthanized prior to weaning, they still need to be counted at that point when they're first manipulated.
Right. Gotcha. Thank you. Okay, next one, I think this is also for you, Dr. Wolf. Regarding animal numbers, could you please comment on the should statement in the guide that indicates the need for statistical justification for group size?
Say that again? Accounting for group size?
Yes, regarding animal numbers, comment on the should statement in the guide that indicates the need for statistical justification for group size.
I'm not exactly sure what they're referring to.
I wonder if this is the National Academy's guideline, the should versus the...
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the should are strong recommendations, whereas a must is a mandatory statement, but I'm not clear about the statistical justification of group size. Is this for the numbers of animals to be used?
I believe that's what the issue, because in a number of IACUCs, from what I understand, Axel, is that if you have 4 groups within your experiment group 1, let's say, is the control group 2, and you have the numbers for each, you have to provide a statistical method that you use to estimate and come up with the numbers for each group. I believe that's the question.
I mean, that's if the question is a should or a must, I mean, a should question can be addressed in some other manner that comes to the same end. But as far as using that method, I think what you just described is what most people probably do.
Gotcha. Okay, makes sense.
I can just
okay, next
I
one.
can add here on that
Okay, yeah.
issue from the perspective of the USDA animal welfare regulations. We're just looking for the appropriateness of the species and numbers. So it certainly could be, you know, a statistical rationale for the number of animals you're using, but if there's another good reason that makes sense to the IACUC, then that's fine too.
Right, that's exactly what I was trying to say too. Right, Betty, thanks.
Okay. Okay, this next question, I'm going to try and cut this down because it is fairly lengthy. DoD continues to be the most burdensome regulatory body. Has that organization begun to consider how to reduce burden? As DoD funding is often used on non-USDA species, it becomes incredibly difficult for institutions to track those protocols.
Well, we can't really speak to what DoD does. They set their own standards. I mean, we're definitely trying to harmonize with as many oversight agencies as possible, but at this point in time, I'm not really, there's nothing on the immediate horizon as far as doing the same initiative that was just done with USDA and FDA with the 21st Century Cures Act. But you know, that's definitely something that can be approached in the future, but OLAW does not have any say-so in how the DoD handles that.
So I can suggest that we could take this back to to COGR and ask on behalf of the membership for COGR to approach DoD on some of these issues. Yeah, it's unfortunate that they weren't part of the effort that USDA and OLA went through, and FDA.
However, I think in the 21st Century Cures Working Group report, they did mention several times how they are working with DoD and the VA to try and streamline these protocol review processes and make things easier across agencies.
Correct.
Okay. For the removal of the literature search requirement for Category D and E procedures in species, does COGR know if those institutions who chose to remove this requirement are private versus public institutions?
Unfortunately, I don't.
That's a good question that we can follow up on.
Yeah, we can follow up on, but I will have to go back and ask folks, to go back to the raw data because I have the summary data in front of me. My apologies, but we'll follow up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Okay, next one. Regarding the pain distress classification, can the USDA speak to whether the annual report is intended to be prospective or retrospective? If retrospective, then does a protocol need to be classified in a pain category or only the animal records following procedures?
This is a great question. And I wish the answer was a little simpler, but the answer is it depends. We want you to make this work for your institution. So a lot of institutions feel like prospective reporting is easier to just do it all at once, kind of collect the numbers when you're doing the protocol approvals or your continuing review and you have everything done at once instead of going back around to find out what the actual numbers are. And prospective reporting is fine with us, with the exception of animals that are reported in the incorrect pain category in the prospective reporting. So in other words, if you think that this group of animals is not going to experience any pain or distress, we're putting them in C prospectively, and nothing happens through the year and everything goes as planned, then that's fine. You just leave it as it is. However, if some of those animals that you had in column C there end up having some pain or distress that can't be relieved, and then they need to move into the correct pain category. So you can take out of your prospective reporting, you can look retrospectively at animals that may have experienced or been in a category of a higher pain level, then they need to be moved before you file your report.
Okay, thank you, Betty. Sally, I think we have a question for you. You mentioned practices at other institutions to minimize burden at Harvard.
I'm sorry, you broke up just a tiny bit.
Yeah, broke up. Same thing. Can you repeat the question? Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Okay. Sally and Ara, you mentioned that practices at other institutions have been implemented to minimize burden. Can you share a few examples of ways that it has worked?
Sure, I can start this. At Harvard, we actually had a faculty and administrative and a veterinary group who looked at our practices and came up with a number of recommendations. The best one was the elimination of the so-called de novo triennial review. And having electronic system, it makes it a lot easier to eliminate that, as well as the annual review of the USDA non-USDA covered species. That eliminated a significant amount of work for the staff who can actually focus that time to do other things such as better or more focused post-approval monitoring. Excuse me. And anecdotally, some of the IACUC members at the Cambridge site also indicated that they love this because by eliminating the annual review, it actually eliminated or gave them rather approximately an hour of extra time that they could focus on higher risk studies. So we felt that this was extremely well worth implementing. That's just one example from our institution. Sally?
Yeah, and I don't have a whole lot to add. It's a very similar experience to ours. Certainly shifting to electronic database system was incredibly helpful and allowed us to tailor some of our things, such as some of the categorization and the not having to do annual renewals with non-USDA species. The other thing I think that's been incredibly helpful is the VVC process.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, one thing that it's done is also it's opened up some pathways of communication, which have been really nice, that there's more of a dialogue on some things. And even if it ends up not being a VVC, it still opens some communication dialogues for our researchers working with our veterinarians and with our support groups to talk about what falls into those categories. So it's that partnership has been really beneficial just in improving the relationships and looking at how we can move those things forward and make sure that they're in the proper categories.
Yep.
But I also just want to mention the Cobra Report actually lists several things that institutions should be considering. And so really that has a really nice list of things that you could look at implementing at your institution.
And I think just to sort of clarify, I think we have implemented pretty much the entire list. I just picked up a couple which were high pay point and sort of significant burdens.
Okay, this question is, we realize USDA does not require literature search for category C. Does PHS require this? Also, does PHS require literature search for non-regulated species?
No, I went over the way that we handle it. People that put in a grant application write what they're going to do in the vertebrate animal section as well, other parts of the grant, and they're going through literature searches while they're developing the study, but there is no explicit requirement for a literature search to reduce the pain and distress levels, because we're already ascertaining that the animals are being handled in ways that reduce pain and distress by asking for the palliative care and the analgesics and the anesthetics, things like that. So that's why I said we come at it from a different approach, but we're still extremely interested in knowing that the animals don't undergo excessive pain and distress in that study. And that's why I pointed out the PHS policy, the US government principles, and then how that information is gathered from the investigator during a grant submission.
Right. Okay, next one. Could you provide some guidance in documenting the process of DMR? This is in comparison of the minutes for full committee review.
You're asking how DMR works? I mean, everybody on the ICOOC has to indicate whether they want it to go to full committee review, or if it goes to DMR, then one or two individuals that are qualified to conduct the review conduct it and have to unanimously come up with an approval. If it has to be disapproved, then it goes back to full committee review, and there should be an accounting in the minutes of the decision and who the designated members were, and that appears in the minutes, similar to like the minutes of FCR, although of course it wouldn't be as expansive.
Axel, this is as a follow-up to this, because in previous meetings, there's been some confusion about this documentation. There are some who believe that documentation means you have to affirmatively hear from every member that they don't want this to go to full committee, while others think that if you tell them a reasonable time frame, let's say it's within 5 days, if you have any questions, please let us know. And that if you don't hear within that reasonable time frame, then that's kind of your document. You don't need additional documentation. Could you clarify that?
Yes, yeah, your description is right. The IACUC develops a policy of the amount of time that they feel is reasonable to hear from people. If there's no response that's considered silent consent, that there is permission to go to DMR. But yeah, you need to know that time frame in advance. Otherwise, people wouldn't know by which time they need to respond. But that's exactly right. 3 days, 5 days, whatever works. And then the expectation is that the ones that don't say anything agree to the protocol going to DMR.
Perfect. Thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
And an additional thing I would mention is that we document the DMR assignments are assigned by the chairperson of our IACUC, and that was requested of us. And also, this process of if you do receive OLA and federal funding, your assurance will specify your process, and then that's what you want to document, is if it's 3 days or whatever that process is, documenting that, and that it went for 3 days for review. There were no comments, so it went to DMR or it got called for FCR, and making sure that it goes through that, and then having the chairperson assign the DMR person to review that and approve that protocol.
Yeah, and let me add that all the DMR members must review identical submissions and changes. So they all have the same copy, even if there have been changes made by the investigator and there's 2 DMR members reviewing it, both of them need to see what those changes are.
Great. The next question is asking about the templates that Sally was referring to when we discussed the VVC. Those are actually available online as an attachment, so you should be able to pull down on your handouts tab. There are 3 attachments available, and one is a Word document containing a guide notice indicating the changes in animal numbers that Axel was referring to, as well as these templates that various institutions have implemented. And if you cannot access those for some reason, I will have my email at the end. You can, of course, feel free to email me, and I will be happy to send that to you. Okay, we've got a lot of questions, and I know we won't be able to get through them all. Okay. In conducting a grant congruence, the VAS section simply states that analgesics will be provided. How and why is this VAS section accepted as complete by NIH?
Well, you don't just look at the VAS. You have to look at other portions of the grant as well, like the methods section maybe. But the VAS is one portion of it that describes key parts of what needs to be looked at, but there needs to be additional information that the person that's reviewing this for congruence needs to look at to make sure that the protocol matches what's in that grant application. The grant application is a very long document, and a lot of the things in there do not have to be looked at, but the animal descriptions of the animal procedures and the vertebrate animal section are definitely items that need to be looked at when conducting the congruence review.
On the topic of approximation of animal numbers, should the IACUC still request a maximum number of animals to be used?
Well, the investigator may not know. I mean, they put their best guess in there, but these numbers can go up and down, and that's why I indicated what needs to occur if they go up and what can occur when they go down. So they're putting their best estimate forward, but that doesn't mean that that's a static number. So yeah, a total should be put in there, but that doesn't mean that it can't be adjusted up or down throughout the course of the study.
Right. Gotcha. Well, we have a lot more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time, and I do want to repeat that this presentation will be available within a week or so, so do not worry if you miss something on a slide or something. This will be made available and you can watch it as many times as you like. I want to take a moment to thank our speakers once again, and for all of you who are watching and listening, thank you so much for your attention. And if you do have any other questions, please do not hesitate to reach me. My email is, as you see up on the screen. I work here at FASA, but if you have anything that you need, please do not hesitate. And again, thank you so much. Please tune in next week for part 2 of our series for the scientist and PI perspective. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you for all your help, Naomi. We appreciate you facilitating and moderating. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.